Hi, everyone, and welcome to this evening's IM Public Lecture, the second one of this academic year. My name is Vivian Howard, and I'm the Acting Director of the School of Information Management here at Dalhousie University. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. We are all treaty people. We also acknowledge the many contributions of the African Nova Scotian community, which has lived on this land for generations. I just wanted to go through a few housekeeping details for tonight's lecture. First of all, the session is being recorded. We would like you to add your questions to the chat, which is on the right-hand side. When questions appear in the feed on the chat, you can upvote them with the thumbs up. The more thumbs up a question receives, the higher priority the question will be given, and that will help ensure that that question is asked. At the end of the lecture today, we'll try to get through as many questions as we can, but if you upvote a question, that really increases the likelihood that it will get asked. And if you would like closed captioning, please click on the CC icon to activate that. So it's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Raymond Frogner, who is the head of archives at the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation at the University of Manitoba. Raymond holds an MA in History and an MAS, a Master of Archival Studies, from UBC. And this evening, Raymond will be speaking about creating a decolonizing archive. After 6 years of work, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada has acquired approximately 4 million documents and over 7,000 survivor statements documenting the history and legacy of the residential school system in Canada. The next step was to order and sort these records to create an archives that could respectfully and effectively preserve and make accessible these records in a manner that addresses the colonial nature of their content and their profound meaning for both Indigenous peoples and settler society to make a decolonizing archives. This talk will discuss the acquisition work to bring in such a disparate set of records and the projects designed to promote their decolonizing reference and use. I'm very pleased now to introduce to you our speaker for tonight, Raymond Frogner.
Tanse, Raymond Frogner, Netsigason, Notari Oscar, Egua, Nigari Doris, Netatoskan, National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Hello, my name is Raymond Frogner. I'm the Director of Archives for the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. I'm speaking to you today from the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I'd like to begin by first thanking the Dalhousie School of Information Management for inviting me to give you this lecture, and I would like to now begin my talk. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, created by the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, is an important signpost in our Canadian archival system's evolving recognition of Indigenous rights. Rights are human creations, and like the systems that recognize them, rights have a history. They continue to evolve. The TRC I discuss holds unique qualities not commonly found in commissions. These qualities are represented in the nature of the archival material that it accumulated. In fact, the nature of the discursive material created to mediate and record information about the settler-Indigenous relationship has constantly evolved to reflect the character of the engagement. From the two-row Wampum Belt of the 18th century intersocietal engagements to land title registers and other textual evidence of 19th century common law, to the activist artwork, individual testimonies, and spiritual ceremonies that describe the holdings of the NCTR. These are the records of a colonial society struggling to find the method for a social memory that can provide a more complete picture of our diverse society. In the words of James Tully, to reimagine belonging in a society of diversity. It's time for our collective cultural houses of memory to rethink such defining principles as homeland, identity, belonging, and community. We have moved beyond the static documentary evidence of our lives to something more dynamic and engaging, but we remain unsure of how to memorialize the core values of our society, both its triumphs and its failures. In this period of change within the Canadian archival profession, archivists are confronted with a legacy of collective trauma that characterizes our relationship with Indigenous peoples. We begin to address this by acknowledging the historic relationship between Canadian public archives and Indigenous peoples, that the role of public archives in the Canadian colonial project was to serve as a kind of documentary armory, preserving the textual evidence to legally enshrine the settler fact. Every truth, every birth, real and imagined, represented a source of coveted heritage. The acquisition programs of Canadian Public Archives form the memory component of a greater colonial equation. Over-informed with the settler's perspective, we've created imperial archives at the cost of a more complete colonial narrative. This historic relationship has created a collective uncertainty in the profession. There's a feeling that there's no clear path forward, and our traditional archival paradigms do not offer effective answers for dealing with our modern colonial archival challenges, some of which include: 1. To publicly acknowledge, interrogate, and heal from a history of colonial genocide. 2. To recognize rights concerning traditional cultural expression and knowledge as common, not private property, and to recognize Indigenous and common law approaches to its ownership. And 3. To open our archival epistemologies to accommodate Indigenous knowledge models built on ideas of space, community, spirituality, and ecology. Indigenous communities have consistently argued for recognition of their inherent rights as Indigenous peoples, but only recently have we seen colonial legal instruments, such as commissions, offer a cognitive space for the Indigenous perspective. These commissions, as legal instruments, embody a national narrative with a profound sense of mistrust and disagreement about the founding of the modern state and the legitimacy of its current authority. The degree to which these investigative programs recognize Indigenous self-determined identities, laws, and cultures is the degree that we can truly say the settler community's relationship with Indigenous peoples is progressing. This concept of respectful engagement has been a consistent claim of Indigenous campaigns for rights since first contact. Intersocietal recognition and accommodation across communities of equals has been a traditional Indigenous governance model. These are traditions of reconciliation that were embodied in the original treaties created from the mid-17th to the early 19th century. I argued that our contemporary TRC is returning to Indigenous traditions of governance, of intersocietal accommodation, and negotiated self-determination. The example most often cited on this concept of respectful intersocietal relations is the exchange of 2 rural Wampum Belts at Niagara in 1764 to enshrine the sovereign Indigenous rights recognized in the Royal Proclamation of 1763. First Nations regarded the agreement, represented by the proclamation and the 2 rural Wampum, as one that affirmed their powers of self-determination. It demonstrates the foundation-building principles of peace, friendship, and respect agreed to between the parties. TRC Commissioner Marie Sinclair has made reference to the lost opportunity of the proclamation and the promise of self-determination captured on the Niagara Ceremony of 1794 and the Wampum Belt created there. The belts, no less than the proclamations, represent materials of social memory. Whether we choose to call them archival is more a question of culture. By the second half of the 19th century, the Crown had abandoned these relationships of mutual esteem. Common law produced a singular doctrine of Crown sovereignty that shaped the political relationships with Indigenous peoples. The law became more of a blunt force instrument for Indigenous dispossession. Proof of sovereignty became documentary evidence of ownership of land, often captured in archival land registers. Pathways of Indigenous self-determination became limited to the stifled arguments of colonial common law. The Cowichan Petition of 1909 is a model document of this era. Thought to be the first official document to make the argument for Aboriginal rights and title written in legal formality, the Cowichan Petition was written by lawyers Clark and O'Meara in 1909 under the direction of Cowichan elders from Vancouver Island. The document, sent to the London British Colonial Office, in Victoria to the BC government, and to Ottawa, influenced the Nisga'a Petition of 1913, which eventually led to the 1973 Calder Supreme Court decision. That decision is generally thought to be the dawn of the modern era of Indigenous activism on rights and title in Canada. There was no other time before the 1960s that Indigenous peoples were closer to forcing Canadian courts to adjudicate the land question than the 2 years between the presentation of the Cowichan Petition in the spring of 1909 and the Dominion election of 1911. Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier had planned to address the issue, recognizing the elders' valid legal initiative, and was even planning to take BC to court to try their land title position, but he was defeated in the federal election. The copy I'm displaying was sent to the provincial government and accessioned by the BC Archives, where it is now available. Since that time, until the 1970s, in the entire history of the residential school system in Canada, there was a total of about a dozen convictions of abuse in residential schools. And I'm going to look at residential schools as the colonial model that we're going to consider as embodying the relationship between Indigenous peoples and settler society. And then into the 70s, we began to see sort of a groundswell of expressions of rights and identity amongst Indigenous communities. Such examples as the 1973 Jane Willis Geniesh publication, Jane Willis publication Geniesh, An Indian Girl, 1976, Anthony Apakark's Thrasher's Skid Row Eskimo in 1977, Alice Massac French's My Name is Massac. And in a sort of a similar fashion, on an international level, we were beginning to witness collective expressions of Indigenous rights in UN forums. Moving into the 1980s, changes in Canadian common law made it possible that Indigenous communities could start to express more effectively the legal expression of their collective rights. And the 1980s actually witnessed significant studies of the Canadian common law and laws of class action. In 1991, Quebec permits class action suits. Ontario follows in 92, and British Columbia in 95. All other provinces then brought in class action legislation in the 2000s. Another significant change in Canadian law concerned sexual offenses. In 1982, an amendment to the criminal code stated no consent is obtained where the complainant submits or does not resist by reason of the exercise of authority. And adding to the, along that line, the famous Blackwater v. Plint decision, which began around the same time in the mid-80s and was concluded in 2005, not only affirmed this amendment to the criminal code, but it also recognized the vicarious liability of affiliated church groups. And then in 1987, we saw Nora Bernard, a Mi'kmaq activist, former student of the Shubenacadie Residential School, begin to interview fellow survivors in the kitchen of her home in Truro, Nova Scotia. It resulted in 2005 in the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian common law history, with an estimated 79,000 survivors, and it was titled originally the National Class Action Settlement. So then we see a response by the federal government in 2003 with a published federal dispute resolution plan. This plan was published to fulfill the recommendations of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which had begun in 1996 to address this groundswell of class actions, and to follow through on Canada's 1998 Statement of Reconciliation, and also to implement the Alternative Dispute Resolution Program, which was Ottawa's effort to try and move all of these class action disputes out of the courtroom and into a less hostile and competitive environment where some kind of social resolution could be found. However, it was still fundamentally based in tort law, and in 2004, the AFN released a publication, Report of Canada's Dispute Resolution Plan, in which they critiqued it for being still very legally oriented, and instead recommended 5 guiding principles for addressing residential schools and the potential for reconciliation. 1, be inclusive, fair, accessible, and transparent. 2, offer a holistic and comprehensive response recognizing and addressing all harms. 3, respect human dignity and equality and racial and gender equality. 4, contribute to reconciliation and healing. And 5, do no harm to survivors and their families. These were fundamentally the principles that inspired the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, which was first agreed upon in 2005, finally fundamentally implemented in 2007. The IRSA was created to put an end to what had become more than 4,000 lawsuits involving tens of thousands of plaintiffs who were suing Canada and the Christian churches that operated the Indian residential schools. The 5 components of the IRSA included 1, the common experience payment, 2, the independent assessment process, 3, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, 4, projects of commemoration, and 5, funding for the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. So turning to the TRC, the mandate of the TRC was expressed in what was known as Schedule N of the IRSA. And its fundamental principles were 1, to acknowledge residential school experiences and consequences, 2, provide a culturally appropriate and safe setting for survivors, their families as they come forward to the Commission, 3, to witness, support, and facilitate truth and reconciliation events, 4, to promote awareness and public education about the IRS system, 5, to identify sources and create as complete an historical record as possible of the IRS system and legacy, and finally, to preserve this record and make it accessible for study and use. Now, to be clear about this, and I'm not saying that, I mean, the TRC did a remarkable job of pulling things together, the historical record as well as the legacy in the form of the testimonies of survivors. But it should be pointed out, this was not a judicial committee. It did not have the power of subpoena. It could not produce an injunction to appear in court or before a tribunal. The goal of the commission was to document the lived experiences of survivors at residential schools. It was known as a victim-centered or truth-seeking commission. The commission relied on the voluntary offering of the statements of survivors to begin a process of healing, reconciliation, and revitalization. And it should be noted, so the success of these sharing circles and sharing panels very much depended on the willingness of survivors and intergenerational survivors to share their truths in a public forum. Now, there is a very valuable and important archival mandate to all of this work. However, the IRSA required an archive, but it never explained the archival process that it required or needed. It did not clarify the vital questions of archival process, such as further acquisition, discovery of records, reference and access, storage and preservation. The IRSA never defines the term archives. The only direct instructions for creating and maintaining an archive in Schedule N is the following 2 lines. Identify the sources and create the most complete historical record possible on the residential school system and its aftermath. This file must be kept and made available to the public for study and future use. And that in its entirety was the instructions that were given for creating an archive and its mission going forward. And it's for that reason actually that I'm giving this presentation to talk about the concept that there is a possibility of making, of rupturing with the past and making something of a decolonizing archive. Now, just to be clear about this, at the time that the IRSA had written, there was references that had been made to what was being described as the archival turn, beginning with Michel Foucault's Order of Things, following through with Jacques Derrida's Archive Fever, Edward Said's Orientalism, an important article by Terry Cook and Joan Swartz, amongst many, which talk about archives, records, and power, published in Archival Science, and Laura Stoller's Along the Archival Grain, and Linda Smith's well-known study, Decolonizing Methodologies. All of these works talk about the archival process as a form of knowledge creation, not just a passive reception of knowledge that's then later made available. And it's in these processes and the work that's done by the archivists that interpret, make finding aids, and other devices of control for the records that knowledge is actually created. And the process of archival work is actually the process of an epistemology and a creation of knowledge. So with that in mind, and also with the sort of with the sort of hole that I've identified in the IRSA, I want to turn a bit to the work that the TRC did and the difficulties that it had in pulling together these records. One of the most difficult challenges that the TRC was confronted with was the fact that the sources for the residential school history were completely dispersed, incredibly dispersed, and that is to say across authorities. So there was 104 church repositories that the TRC visited: Sisters of Charity of Halifax, the Presbyterian Church in Canada, United Church General Council, les Oblats de Marie Immaculée du Manitoba. The church repositories, all of them kept their records in different manners. Some followed archival standards, others improvised and made up their own, and still others did not have any sort of sense of organization or even file lists to mention. So the TRC spent 6 years trying to acquire these records under the mandate of the IRSA with a Supreme Court order, but struggling with the fact that there was a complete inconsistency in the way that the records were arranged, described, and made available. Similarly, in turning to government records, the TRC considered 47 sets of government records. This includes both provincial and federal government offices, including the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Privy Council Office. So the immense and disparate types of authorities of these records had to be dealt with when the records were being collected. Similarly, these records were dispersed in physical location. To give one example, the Oblates of OMI-Lacombe, also known as the Grandin Province, are located predominantly in 5 different repositories in the Provincial Archives of Alberta, the Société Historique de Saint-Boniface, the Royal BC Museum and Archives, the Vancouver Diocese, and the Provincial Archives of Saskatchewan. And at this moment in time, in fact, the NCTR continues to work with the Oblates and write memorandums of agreement with all of these repositories to collect the records of the Oblates that document their relationship to residential schools in the history of Canada. And similarly for federal government records, there's over 47 repositories across the country that all of whom had to turn over their records in due time within the 6 years. And in fact, the TRC found themselves in court 3 different times, making reference to the Supreme Court order in order to get the federal government to turn over records for their research. So to give a bit of a summary so that's the history of the records, or the historical documentation of the schools. The TRC was also responsible to document the legacy, and this was found, as I've mentioned, in the statements that were collected. So in the 6 years of work, the TRC visited over 200 Indigenous communities across the country, holding public sharing panels, public sharing circles, and in these events, they also held private statements where survivors and intergenerational survivors insisted on giving their truths or sharing their statements in a private environment, although in some cases they were still willing to allow the records or the testimonies to be shared for the purposes of education, healing, reconciliation. In those cases, the TRC collected 3,639 private statements. They're also sharing circles and sharing panels, groups and public events where volunteers would come forward and share their stories, share their truths about their experiences, the legacies of the residential school system. So for the total of sharing circles, those over 1,100 statements gathered, and for sharing panels, over 1,900. For a total of statements that is 6,757, it's now surpassed 7,000 as the NCTR continues to collect stories. But this is the legacy. So combined, there was a historical documentation and a legacy of the residential schools. And then just to summarize, in many of these events, there were multiple cameras. There was also different recording devices. So the total number of AV files that resulted in all of the work, the national events, the sharing circles, the private expressions and statements that were gathered, there's over 44,000 AV files now in the holdings of the NCTR for a total of over 106 terabytes and over 2,500 hours. And in total, considering all digital files, sound, AV, photographs and maps, etc., there's almost 250 terabytes in total that now reside in the holdings of the NCTR, which is a considerable amount of work, and the TRC should be saluted for that. So going forward, the question I had when I came to the NCTR, which is in 2016, 1 year after the TRC closed, was what to do with these records. And as I've noted, due to the fact that they came from almost 100 different repositories from across the country, gathered in different circumstances in French and English in a period of over 6 years, the first thing that needed to be done was to somehow create order, to make some kind of a consistency in the description so that they could be placed into a sort of a relational database environment where you could then carry out research and discovery of the records in a consistent and reliable manner. So in order to do this, I recognized that this was an enormous cost, and so I turned to the Canada Foundation for Innovation grants. And now I was warned, and I recognize that these grants are normally made for science research. Typically, they fund laboratories and equipment for scientific experiments. The CFI makes financial contributions to universities, colleges, and hospitals to increase their capacity and to carry out high quality research. So just as a thumbnail overview, the formal objectives of the CFI is to increase Canada's ability to carry out important world-class scientific research and technology development, support economic growth, job creation, expand research and job opportunities through research infrastructure and development, and promote productive networks and collaboration amongst universities and colleges. So immediately you can see this is a difficult fit for the records of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So the first thing I was confronted with is to try and rethink what is research infrastructure. And again, I'm very much reminded of Linda Smith and her ideas about Indigenous research methodologies and many others. And having spoken to many different community elders, knowledge keepers, and representatives, there's an enormous gap between what the CFI was understanding as research infrastructure and what was required to make a decolonizing archive where the records could be used in a way that's both meaningful and sensible for communities. So from the CFI's perspective, infrastructure included state-of-the-art equipment, laboratories, databases, specimens, scientific collections, computer hardware and software, communications linkages, and buildings necessary to conduct leading-edge research. So on all of those cases, the TRC's records were kind of on the margin. It was clear that it was, as I said, a bit of a difficult fit. So to reframe the concept of innovative research through decolonization, I stated explicitly the very first lines of my grant application, and the application came to over 100 pages in the end, that this project implements the NCTR's digital architecture. It enables advanced discovery and access of digital archival records to promote innovative research meaningful to Indigenous communities. It uniquely provides researchers materials to theorize oppression and disrupt the colonial relationships between academic researchers and Indigenous communities. So the first step in my application was to try to move the goalposts, reframe the idea of innovative research, and insert into that the concept of somehow decolonizing archival practices and decolonizing the record to make it meaningful to Indigenous communities. Now, in addition to reshaping the idea of innovative research, I had to place it into the context of the residential school experience. And for that, I wrote in the very next paragraph of my intro, access to the NCTR archives is a public good. This proposed infrastructure will enable vital digital projects to identify the children lost at residential schools, to discover the locations of unmarked residential schools' grave sites, to create a statistical analysis of the health and welfare legacy of residential schools, to design collaborative and innovative health and education programs with Indigenous communities. This infrastructure promotes reconciliation through acknowledgement. It's a recognition that we are what we choose to remember, but we are also what we choose to forget. So this is my attempt to try and reshape the CFI into something that could address the research projects that the NCTR was committed to pursue. Now, the immediate question that came to mind, and one that I repeatedly had to justify in the application, was, what do I mean when I'm talking about a decolonizing archive in a contemporary archival context? And I basically made the argument, and this isn't original, this is taken from many other archival thinkers as well, that there are basically 6 points to a decolonizing archive. It recognizes the embedded colonizing role played by traditional colonial archives. It acknowledges the overlapping multiplicity of rights, provenance, and the diverse meanings embodied in the archival document. It recognizes archival evidence is not a fact, it is a matrix of relationships. And like all relationships, it's vulnerable to mistrust and trust, good faith and manipulation. 3, it's a living archive, a place of gathering and participation. It does not preserve static records frozen in time, but recognizes their dynamic, evolving intergenerational meaning for communities and individuals. 4, it provides a social memory infrastructure that supports indigenous cognitive practices. 5, it breaks out of the textual paradigm of archival evidence. It will build on the digital potential to interrelate diverse genres of social memory to create a holistic center of social memory, recognizing the spiritual and environmental in the context of local social sanction. And finally, it'll offer a safe and accessible space for Indigenous peoples to learn of and freely express their views on the legacy of the residential school experience, and for a settler society to listen, encounter, and acknowledge and reconcile. So that is what I kept front and center in the application, to try and make it clear that this, if we could fund the infrastructure, would be what we would create with this decolonizing archive. So I had 5 principal projects that I looked at, that I came up with, that to my mind would address this issue of creating a decolonizing archive. All of these projects in one way or another addresses those issues. So just to list them: 1, upgrade the IT infrastructure to better manage technically and culturally the NCTR's digital material. 2, to collaborate with the National Film Board of Canada to preserve and make accessible the over 7,000 survivor statements that have been collected. 3, collaborate with the Manitoba Centre for Health Policy to study the longitudinal adult health legacy of childhood residential school trauma, to take the evidence created from this unprecedented study to design, in partnership with Indigenous communities, new models of healthcare delivery, child welfare, and education programs. 4, to design free NCTR data workshops for Indigenous researchers and community representatives to consult the NCTR data in an Indigenous-driven approach to research. And 5, to design an open source IT platform to support a collaborative National Register of Unmarked Grave Sites and related missing children's database. So those were the 5 large main projects that I proposed would help the NCTR to create a decolonizing archive. And I'm pleased to say that in the end we did get the grant. We received over $6 million to go forward with those projects. And then if I could, I'd just like to expand a little bit on each of the projects to give you a better idea of what they are. First of all, the information architecture. Within the CFI, section 4.6.3, for those out there that are following along with their CFI applications, that section concerns databases and digital libraries, and it supports cleaning data, coding, format conversion, data entry, and data transfer. And this one, and I'll go further, design, development, beta testing, piloting, commissioning, and integration of the database to merge an organization of existing data that are not already in usable reference units. And this is exactly what we were faced with. The TRC did create multiple databases, all for different projects and different purposes. They also made a distinction in databases between private and public records. And there was a need to normalize the formats to try and bring the metadata, sort of to tame it to the ground and make it consistent within the ISAR and ISAD standards that we were going to be using for our records. So we were able to sell this component maybe most easily for our application, that we were cleaning, sorting, and making the information that was collected available for research going forward. And that's the IT architecture. To the NFB collaboration, as one of our EV experts had said, what we really had, given the fact that when the TRC went into these communities, they often hired local videographers. So the formats were different, the production values were different, the sound was different, the lighting, everything. And as one person described it, given its content, what we really held were extremely valuable home movies, that they needed to be transcoded into an AV file format that was compliant with preservation standards, and would use the Open Archival Information System model, which many of you might be familiar with. So we're also working with the NFB to design a process to preserve the B-roll recordings. So in all of these events, the sharing circles, the sharing panels, there was often other cameras, other sound recordings that were being made at the time. These B-rolls are also part of our holdings, and also need to have not just a method of preservation, but a way to link them to what we're calling the original, which is the version that is formatted for public access, and is saved in the digital repository as the original master. The NFB is also going to be creating what they call mezzanine versions of these recordings. These will be the ones that would be made available for any kind of researcher who wants to use a copy for the purposes of documentaries, filmmaking, or any kind of production. And of course, we also have online low-res versions that will be made of all of the AV recordings. You can go online already to our website and view most of these recordings. For the most part, the sharing panels and sharing circles are in the public domain, and we could put them onto our website without worries of intellectual property rights. And also, they were recorded with the express purpose of healing, revitalizing communities, understanding and reconciliation. So you can view a considerable amount of these recordings already online. What I would advise is that there is a need to self-care when you are viewing these, because many of the recordings do have very disturbing content in them. The third component was to collaborate with the Manitoba Centre for Health Policy. And this, to my mind, going forward, is I think our most valuable project in the CFI program. And when I speak with elders and knowledge keepers from communities, they also get most excited about the potential for this project. It's basically the Manitoba Centre for Health Policy will relate health, education, and social welfare records that they already have access to with the unique identifying evidence of social trauma that's held in the documents of the NCTR. And with this kind of statistical analysis, it'll be able to prove without any doubt that there was a harmful and difficult legacy that resulted from these schools. But it would also result in a possibility to better understand health, education, community histories, and hopefully allow for unprecedented policy and program development designed collaboratively with settler institutions and Indigenous communities. So to get a fuller and better understanding of the social impact of these residential schools, and thereby produce better social programs and assist Indigenous communities in revitalization and healing that will take generations. A fourth component, the NCTR data workshops, we are proposing to use, potentially I'm thinking of the database system, open source application R, but we're open to other potential applications as well. But these will be workshops for band councils, community members, and independent Indigenous researchers to take lessons in just interrogating the data that's held at the NCTR, so that Indigenous communities will drive the data consultation. We'll have 3 tiers: beginner, intermediate, and advanced, and we hope to launch these workshops in the near future. And finally, of course, the open source IT platform will also be funded by this, and it will help with very important projects such as the study into unmarked grave sites across the country. It will help us continue with our research into missing children. We already have phase 1 of our missing children research has been done, which has looked into over 1/3 of our records to determine the evidence of 4,118 children that have been lost at residential schools. We still have 2/3 of our holdings to go through. And in this project funded by CIRNA, we hope we'll have a report within 1.5 years. If you go to our site already, we have a commemoration section which lists off in honor of to commemorate and honor the children lost and the families left behind. And what you'll notice is that it is very thin on information. It's the name of the child, or one of the known names of the child, and the last known school that that child attended, and the date of the death. The information is kept to that amount because of advice that we gathered after consulting Indigenous communities around the country for almost 8 months. So this was decided to be enough information to publicly commemorate the loss of those children. Now, in addition to that, we've responded to call to action number 72 by also creating what was called in the calls to action a death register, an unpleasant name, but that's what they called it. And in the death register, each child is profiled with 16 fields of information: cause of death, gender, home community, language spoken, original name, and that death register is available only to families. It can be accessed under special permission by a formal application to the NCTR, but for the moment and going forward, it will be available only to families. So with those projects, through the CFI, we are aiming to create what we're calling a decolonizing archive. We've moved from the tool of Wampum Belt, from the couch and petition, to something more engaging, dynamic, and hopefully decolonizing. So I thank you all, and available for questions now.
Thank you so much, Raymond. That was an absolutely fascinating lecture, and it raised so many important issues about Canadian history, about the way we do research, and so many issues related to just information management itself. So let's turn to some of the questions, and if people have further questions, please just put them in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So I'll start with, actually, it's my question, and that is, the scale of this project is just enormous. I mean, it is immense, and your role in particular is balancing a knowledge of colonial history and an ability to form relationships, and also just technical archival skills. So could you maybe just talk a little bit about how your prior training or experience prepared you to step into this role, and what skills you think are the most important in the work you do?
Well, I did have a graduate level background in social history in Canada, and I did spend a lot of my time when I was at the University of Alberta, for example, teaching a course in Indigenous Studies, working with the records of local Indigenous communities, and in fact, also working with a very valuable colonial set of records known as the William Pierce Papers, which we worked on digitizing, myself and the staff there, in the early 2000s. And that was actually almost like a beta testing kind of proving ground, where we digitized over 600 of the manuscripts of the Pierce Papers, as well as several hundred of his photographs, and worked to interrelate them in a relational database environment. And that practice actually gave me a really good insight into open source database development. And then going forward, we were able to turn to Artifactual and the community of archivists that work there. And what was great about them is that, their staff is predominantly trained archivists as well as IT specialists. And it's one of the few sort of independent companies that actually have that bridge between archival concerns and IT work. And we worked quite closely with them on the development of the database. And fundamentally, when we made our RFP to develop our IT architecture, one of the baseline criteria was that it had to be an open source system solution, and they were able to offer that to us. So we spent a good 2 years working with them on a 10-year preservation policy program. We've implemented Archivematica with a workflow to preserve the records and normalize all the digital records that were created by the TRC. And it's half knowledge of IT that we have here at the center, and half trying out innovations that we think will work. One thing that we are very hopeful for is working with developers here at our center to make a participatory description app for the photographs that we hold. We have over 30,000 photographs, and most of them have been given a colonial description. They've been described by the teachers and administrators of those residential schools, often without identifying the children in the photos. So what we're trying to do, and I know LAC has already done this with their collab project. So we're doing something similar with photographs to start with, and we're going to offer the opportunity to juxtapose Indigenous descriptions of the photographs to not remove the colonial descriptions of the photographs, but juxtapose a contemporary Indigenous viewpoint onto the photograph, and then relate them to documents. If we can start working with linked data in a more effective manner, we're hopeful that we can start bringing in different disparate data sets that will create what we're sort of thinking of as virtual student case files. To date, the records have been organized by colonial principles, by the schools, by the religious orders, by the government office, but never by the student themselves. So what we're hoping to do with linked data and our open source relational databases, try to create these virtual case files where we can search a disparate set of records that combined document the life of a child who's attended a residential school over several years. But again, these are kind of, we just have idea sessions and start thinking about what we can come up with in an open source environment. And I'm glad to say that having an open source environment does open, to incredible potential for these sorts of projects. And I think because they are digital and the records are also audiovisual as well, we have begun to move out of this textual paradigm, and it truly is happening when you look at our site and you can see the artwork, the testimonies. It goes much beyond the textual record. So I don't know, I've kind of wandered off of your question, but I do think that that's kind of, it's been a lot of innovation combined with experience working with archives.
Yeah, no, the breadth of the project is really quite astonishing. And we have another question, kind of following. I think it's a good segue from what you were just talking about. So it's asking what you believe are the most pervasive challenges with truth and reconciliation efforts today. And then a follow-up question, how can data sharing be improved with greater online access points in communities with low access to decolonizing archives and or IT architecture, or just internet access at all?
Well, I guess the first one is the enormous question of as I said at the start, how to create some kind of a homeland and recognition and belonging in a culture or a society of diversity. And fundamentally, it is building relationships, and these will be relationships that will happen over generations. And I mean, realistically, when people ask me, what do you want to see as the relationship with Indigenous communities, or the settler Indigenous relationship, my response is always, well, we are already in that relationship. The question is, how do we want it to look? And so going forward, we have to start building these kinds of relationships across settler and Indigenous communities on a local level, and build those relationships going forward for generations. As Murray Sinclair made the observation in his final report that it took almost seven generations to sort of decompose these Indigenous communities. It's going to take several generations to revitalize them. But getting involved in local in local programs that begin to celebrate Indigenous communities in a local context, recognize the value of Indigenous ideas and spirituality in the local context, through small steps for building relationships across these divides that have been separating us for so long. For the IT side, I mean, we do want, as much as possible, to practice replevin. We want Indigenous communities to be able to stand alone with their own records in a spirit of like the OCAP principles, that that fundamentally these records belong to those communities, and if we can't immediately transfer them over to them, that we have to have, as I mentioned before, these kinds of linked data sets that will start pulling together these disparate, a hospital record, a school record, an Indian affairs record, that all document the life of a single child. I think linked data can start to do that sort of work. And then as on open source platforms, we can start giving the possibility of social media commentary. As I said, we never want to destroy or eliminate these colonial metadata descriptions, we want to try and interrogate them, understand them, and try to place them in a juxtapose kind of understanding with where we are today. As for the bandwidth question, I honestly believe that that's just going to be resolved with future IT development. There is, something to be said for the fact of maybe having some kind of, in my dreams, a sort of an indigenous collective commons where there could be, a mutually shared digital environment where indigenous communities could, safeguard and share their precious memories, their social memories, and that in that same way they could then overcome the sort of private ownership model of copyright and start promoting community ownership of these valued memories. And then if someone did indeed want to use them in another context for journalism or academic purposes or movies or something like that, then they could pay to that community, to that collective commons, and then the commons could use the money for education, development, or some other purpose. So I think there are IT developments that are coming up that will make this more and more possible. I don't know, maybe I'm too optimistic, but I think the IT question itself will resolve itself. My bigger question is whether it will be resolved with, if I could say it, the forces of capitalism. If it's private enterprise that makes that decision, or somehow we can have collective recognition of Indigenous communities' rights shaping those solutions.
Yeah, thank you, Raymond. That's yeah, it just points out some of the disparities that continue within the Canadian society and are so important to remember. We have another question that really hits at some of the innovation that you were talking about, and the fact that so much of the work that you've been doing is kind of finding new ways of doing things or breaking new ground. So the comment and then the question. The comment is, it seems that the impressive dimensions of this work is likely generating new archival methods, practices, new information retrieval approaches, and so on. And you were just kind of alluding to that, especially with regard to Indigenous knowledge. Are steps being considered to report these types of discoveries? And I know that you've recently had a publication that talks about some of this. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how that meta process of creating this archive is being reported out to the archival world.
Oh, for sure. So yeah, I guess it's been almost 2 weeks now. I had an article that came out in the journal known as Archival Science, and on the theme of implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in public archives. So we did report on that. And also we've presented at a UBC conference last year where we were looking at the possibility of developing a linked data project. We're still pursuing that. We're hoping to get a SURE grant that will push that even further. And talking about Indigenous epistemologies, I do think what they call the ontologies of linked data, the thesauruses that get created that link different sets of data across disparate and siloed database collections. Those ontologies are, for me, the biggest question. At the moment, places like LAC or large international bodies are housing those ontologies, and then I would suppose that they're the ones responsible to update them, to maintain them, that sort of thing. I believe that there has to be, as I was saying before, in the idea of an Indigenous commons, there needs to be a collective movement, and maybe it's led by something like the First Nations governance institution, but there needs to be a collective movement amongst Indigenous communities to come together and start expressing those ontologies in a way that can be adapted to things like linked data programs. Hopefully, hopefully we get the shirt going forward, and I mean we have several communities in mind that we'd like to work with to develop this kind of thing, and then it'll be published in local in archival journals, I would imagine, but more importantly, it would be online for the general public to look at in various websites.
That's great, thank you. And probably this will have to be our final question because we only have 5 minutes left. But it's a question about the state of transcription and translation of relevant missionary historical records. For example, the questioner says there's a source at the Provincial Archives of Alberta called the Codex Historicus, handwritten in French by Oblate missionaries, and it was unavailable, for me to access in my undergrad for a history paper. So, is there sort of a parallel effort to transcribe and translate records? And maybe comment on that.
Yeah, there certainly is, and we're quite well aware of the holdings that you're referring to at the Provincial Archives of Alberta, and we're currently in talks with the PAA to select, scan, and transfer those records over to the NCTR that are relevant and document the Oblates' work with residential schools. The Oblates did run over 48 schools in Western Canada, and we have negotiated, and it's on our website, in fact, an expression of good faith with the Oblates to the effect that they wish us to have complete and unhindered access to all their records to make them available, and then even the personnel files, which they say they would still like to maybe, for those priests still alive, perhaps have some kind of restriction, but otherwise complete open access to all Oblate records that give any kind of indication of the activities of Oblates with residential schools. So getting those records would be step one. The next step would be to digitize and make them available on our site. We're now in the process of implementing an OCR program that would allow full OCR, full text searching of all typed documents that enter into the database. So hopefully that'll be implemented within 6 to 8 months, and then every typed document that we hold in our database could be full text searched in French and English. Those that remain handwritten, such as the codexes, I see no way around it. There has to be some kind of crowdsourced transcription of the document. I just don't see AI coming around to this at any time, and the cost would be so enormous. But my thought was always, using classrooms or Indigenous communities to come together and do collective transcriptions of these works, to type out or to transcribe these codexes, and then once they are, then we can, completely make them available on our site without any problem. Now that we have this infrastructure available.
Great, thank you so much, Raymond. And maybe just a very quick question, I'll just try and squeeze in. How unique is this archive? I mean, I know other countries have gone through truth and reconciliation processes. Does South Africa have a similar archive, in Australia, New Zealand?
I think this is supremely unique. And in fact, I'm just about to submit a UNESCO application to the Memory of the World to have it recognized as having value, having world value. We've been recognized by the Canadian Office of UNESCO, and they recommended us to do an international application. The very fact that the TRC collected over 7,000 statements of survivors and intergenerational survivors and linked that to historical documentation of those residential schools. I don't know of any other commission that has gone so far. And then now that we've been able to work with them to make these records available in the way we have, I think it is a highly unique assemblage of records on an international scale.
Yeah, that was my impression as well. So thank you for confirming that, and congratulations, and just so impressive, all the work that you and your team have done. So thank you for sharing it with us today. I guess it's time now to draw this evening's public lecture to a close. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I hope you have a very good evening. Thank you, Raymond, for that fascinating lecture. Please look out for announcements of our next public lecture coming later this month on November 29th, and that will be featuring Ashley Casavan, who is Executive Director of Responsible AI. Hopefully, we will see you at that event as well. Thanks again for coming, and thank you, Raymond. Good night.
Good night.